Good afternoon, and welcome to Paraphilias. All week long I've been wanting to say that. Paraphilias is the sixth and final of this series called Sextet, all on sexuality. We started with mating and captivity. We did the biology of sexuality, the chemistry of intimacy. Last week was voyeurism, for which we showed Blow Up as the film to introduce the Roundtable. And last night we showed Pasolini's Sallow. And I have to report that we started with 17 people and did, I think we had, how many did we have in the end? About 7? Yeah.
You and Matt.
Yeah, and I was ticketed on the way out because for infecting someone's imagination. Anyway, the art you see on the walls is from an exhibit that is attendant upon this series on sexuality. And the title is The Body as Image. It's curated by Hallie Cohn with the help of Adam Ludwig. And it's you have a number of artists who have worked in varying media. And so we have a Philip Pearlstein painting. We have a quilt. It's a Philip Pearlstein drawing. We have a quilt by Katie Commodore in the other room, which is composed of sadomasochistic images. But it's a diverse and often perverse depiction and graphic depiction of some of the themes that have been dealt with over these 6 weeks. Now, Edward Albee, Nicholson Baker, Judith Thurman, and Simon Winchester are all scheduled to be on panels at the Philoctetes Center this coming fall and into the winter. So go to philoctetes.org, look at calendar, and consult our schedule. We have a very ample program, as you can see, and there are changes and additions all along. So you should look at the calendar and see what's coming up. All Philoctetes roundtables are available. People constantly come up to me. I know I've said this before, but they're always asking me, how can I see this? I missed it. We have it all. We have a 3-camera setup. This is being recorded and simulcast right now. So you just go to past programming. You go to our site and you go to past programming and hit the little button, and you can see, like in about 3 days, you'll be able to see this particular panel. I am now pleased to introduce Otto Kernberg. Otto Kernberg is director of the Personalities Disorder Institute at the New York Presbyterian Hospital, Westchester Division, and the professor of psychiatry at the Weill Medical College of Cornell University. Dr. Kernberg is past president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He is also training and supervising analyst at the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research. He is the author of 12 books and co-author of 12 others. His most recent books are Aggressivity, Narcissism, and Self-Destructiveness in the Therapeutic Relationship, and New Developments in the Psychopathology and Psychotherapy of Severe Personality Disorders. Dr. Kernberg will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests.
Thank you. You want me to do it from here, from there?
You can do it right from there.
Okay, good. First of all, let me just give you the general description of what we are supposed to talk about, in case you all haven't seen it. Paraphilias is the title. Just as children express and reveal their conscious and unconscious fantasies through imaginative play, so do adults through their sexual play. In relationships where anxiety is relatively absent and where trust, empathy, and intimacy prevail, adults play sexual games that have variety, playfulness, and flexibility, with the ultimate goal of sexual satisfaction. When such play becomes rigid, repetitive, ritualistic, and compulsory, and when the game becomes the goal, often accompanied by anxiety, intense ambivalence, and a strong predominance of aggressive feelings over tender, loving feelings, psychoanalysts talk about paraphilia, perversion. I'm going to comment on that sentence in a minute. This roundtable will bring together participants from different disciplines to contribute to this subject. I just summarized what we all received as the subject, and I would like to correct it. It's not psychoanalysts who talk about paraphilia, perversion. It's psychiatrists. In other words, it is in the classification, the DSM system, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 3 and 4, where paraphilias was introduced to replace the term of perversion. because perversion sounds something bad, ugly, disgusting. Psychiatrists want to remain pure above all of this, and therefore the term paraphilia was invented. I'm saying this because it's really an expression of, I believe, maybe this is already the beginning of discussion, of conventional cultural biases on what's supposed to be a scientific classification. I assure you I could give you many other examples of such invasion of cultural bias on what looks like science, but I'll leave it at that. In any case, clinically, we talk about perversions, clinically. When any particular activity involving sexual interaction, particularly of sadistic, masochistic, voyeuristic, exhibitionistic, fetishistic quality, becomes so rigid and repetitive, and sexual excitement and orgasm linked so narrowly to that particular activity that it shows clearly that the loss of the broad spectrum of sexual behavior. That in turn may occur under very different circumstances with very different qualities. That's already, I guess, part of the discussion. In any case, this is what's meant by perversion and by paraphilias. The members of our panel, starting on my right, is Dr. Arnold Davidson, Robert Anderson, Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Comparative Literature, the Divinity School, and the Committee on the Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science at the University of Chicago. He's also director of the France-Chicago Center, executive editor of Critical Inquiry, professor of the history of political philosophy at the University of Pisa, and director of the European Network in Contemporary French Philosophy. He's the author of The Emergence of Sexuality and co-author of a book of conversations with Pierre Hadot, La philosophie comme manière de vivre. He's the co-editor of the official French anthology of the writings of Michel Foucault, and serious editor of the 13 volumes of the English language edition of Foucault's course on the Collège de France. His major writings are in Italian and French as well as in English. Next year he will give the Venetian lectures at the University of Venice on philosophy, improvisation and jazz. On his right is Dr. Richard Krueger, psychiatrist and medical director of the Sexual Behavior Clinic at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He's associate clinical professor of psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons. He's board certified in internal medicine, psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and addiction psychiatry. He consults on individuals who have committed sexual crimes for the New York State Office of Mental Health, and his research interests and publications have focused on the psychopharmacological treatment of aggressive and compulsive sexual behavior. He was recently appointed to the Sexual Disorders Work Group for DSM-5. Everybody knows the two characters sitting in front of me. To their right in turn is Miss Susan Winemaker, who studied philosophy at McGill University and classic French cuisine at the Rosemount Culinary Institute in Montreal. She pursued cooking professionally in Montreal, New Orleans, and finally London, where she moved in 1998. At the turn of the millennium, she traded in her chef's whites for black rubber and whips, becoming London's most dedicated professional dominatrix. Winemaker is the author of Concertina, The Life and Loves of a Dominatrix, a memoir of extreme and indulgent tastes published in 2008. Currently, Susan spends time in London and Toronto working on her second book and learning German. On her right is Dr. Linda Williams, that is on my left, is Dr. Linda Williams, who teaches courses on popular movie image genres, pornography, melodrama, and body genres of all sorts at the University of California at Berkeley. She has recently taught courses on Oscar Michaud and Spike Lee, Eastern and Western melodrama, film theory, pornography, and the wider phenomenon of screening sex in mainstream American film. Her edited books include Viewing Positions, a volume on film spectatorship, Reinventing Film Studies with Christine Gledhill, and a collection of essays on pornography, porn studies. In 1989, Williams published a study of pornographic film entitled Hardcore, Power, Pleasure, and, quote, the Frenzy of the Visible, close quote. In 2001, she published a book on racial melodrama, Playing the Race Card, Melodramas of Black and White, from Uncle Tom to O.J. Simpson. Her latest book, Screening Sex, chronicles the revelation and concealment of sex in movies, from Edison's The Kiss to new media. We have received instructions to talk freely to each other, so we'll take the time until 4 p.m. doing that, and then opening the conversation to the audience as well. I encourage the audience to hold your horses and wait until 4 p.m. At the same time, we've been asked to talk freely and formally about the issues that interest us for mutual education and information. So we are supposed to be engaged in a selfish encounter that hopefully will carry some interest for everybody else. And I thought of taking the prerogative of the chairman, just throwing in a few of the kind of interests I have. After that, I'll see my main role is trying to limit everybody, including myself. That's the most difficult, to the time allotted. So that we have a chance to interact. What interests me is really the nature of the relation between convention, cultural attitude towards sexuality, and private sexuality. I think historically there is a strange oscillation throughout the ages between times of Puritanism and times of libertinism. The times of, I won't go to details, but I'm raising the question whether these cycles are alternating more rapidly during the last and present century. During times of libertinism, it's free sex for all, and intimacy of sex and love become hidden in personal relations that detach from the culture. In the time of Puritanism, terrible prohibition against all sex, and again, sexuality folds into the private life of the sexual couple. I see a kind of a dialectic between private and public attitude towards sexuality in both cases. I'm interested whether others may have thoughts about that. I'm interested in the manifestation of the suppression of sexuality is directed particularly against what psychoanalysts call the polymorphous, perverse, infantile aspect of sexuality. In other words, our sadistic, masochistic, voyeuristic, exhibitionistic fetishistic tendencies that are universal and part of sexual play and activity that enrich it. And that's what most clamped upon, both in courses about sexuality in school and in film, where there is a strict division between open expression of all these polymorphous, perverse, infantile activities and fantasies in the pornographic film, restricted to people who seem to be mentally retarded. At least this is the impression that many of the actors give. But other than that, total freedom. On the other hand, in the conventional film, total suppression of polymorphous, perverse, infantile sexuality, except when it is sex between people who basically hate themselves. But husband and wife who are taking care of the education of their children, if they're shown in bed, it is all in purified gesture. The film that shows mature sexuality, where intimacy, love, sex, polymorphous, perverse sexuality are combined, are difficult to tolerate for the general audience. They are generally not very popular. There are a few exceptions, but those that are usually are misunderstood by the broad public. So it is as if it takes a lot of emotional maturity to even tolerate the breakdown of that censorship. I don't know whether that is mostly because of individual psychology or again because we are all so influenced by conventionality. Anyhow, that's a major subject of my interest. In terms of my professional work, I'm the other area that, of course, interests me profoundly regarding sexuality is the observation that in patients with usual neurotic illness, there's usually some sexual inhibition, and psychoanalysts have a lot to say about that. But when we go to more severe levels of pathology, really very severe personality disorders, we find often an apparent freedom in terms of polymorphous, perverse sexuality, but accompanied by severe distortions in the capacity for intimacy and love. So it's as if the deterioration of the interpersonal function permits a degree of freedom as against cultural issues. And it seems to me that that is interesting. Of course, ideal treatment should lead to the kind of synthesis that I've already implied between love and sexuality. So, open to everybody.
Well, I think I'd like to speak, since you spoke so much about film because film is a kind of a barometer of where we are and what we, as you put it, are willing to tolerate and what we are willing to engage with and be sort of sexually interested in. And I think you're generally right. I'm only talking about American movies. I recently wrote a book called Screening Sex, which is interested in the history of all the dirty parts, the sex that happens in movies, from the era of what I call the kiss, which is all that was tolerated in American cinema. That is to say, a kiss of a certain duration during the era of the production code, and usually not a kiss that would end, usually a kiss that would lead to a cut to another place and another time, kisses that were very brief and that were not very sexual. But American cinema as American culture has changed. And after this period that I call the long adolescence of American cinema, when the kiss was the only sex that you could really expect to see, we did, in the 1960s, undergo a kind of a sexual revolution in which we began to see a certain amount of sexual play, some of what might be called the paraphilias beginning to emerge. In fact, it's very interesting. Thomas Edison's film A Kiss, which was about 10 seconds long, and it was a man and a woman kissing. And it was a very early film. I would bookend with Andy Warhol's film called Kiss, which is nothing but lascivious, long kisses between all sorts of people, including men and interracial couples, and that you never have a beginning and you never have an end, and it's just a kind of glorying in open mouths and saliva and all the things that you do not see in the normal screen kiss. After the 60s, America did undergo a kind of a sexual revolution, and movies did begin to, in very boring ways, very rigid, formulaic ways, began to show us sex. If you think of The Graduate, everyone remembers that moment when they start to have sex, and then we get a very careful montage with a lot of music, lots of loud music, so that we don't have to hear any sexual sounds. And that's sort of the way sex scenes in American movies have been done, with a lot of music and a careful montage, and it's kind of carefully cordoned off from the rest of the... That's the normal way. But this question of when you get sexual maturity and sexual play seems to me in the 80s, if you think of a film like David Lynch's Blue Velvet, which has a primal scene, a very disturbing primal scene, witnessed by a voyeur in a closet, which has a scene of threatened castration, which then has a scene of very, very dark sadomasochistic sex. That was a moment when American audiences sat in theaters and witnessed a new kind of paraphiliac sex. And I don't know how they felt. I know that it was disturbing to many people, but they were interested, and they were willing to be interested in front of that screen with other people around them. And now I think that there is a new tendency to break down that dichotomy that you referred to, the dichotomy between pornography over here and movies like The Graduate and the inheritors of the, the PG or the restricted kind of simulated sex. We now have a category that I like to call hardcore art, which definitely is descended from something like the film some of you saw last night, but there are many different kinds, and this is a period in the last 10 years in which it is possible to see more than simulated sex in a variety of forms in which people are imaginatively playing with sex. These films are sometimes seen widely, sometimes not seen at all. One of the more recent examples on American screens, a film that failed commercially but which did have what I call hardcore art, would be a film like Short Bus, which celebrated actually used the word polymorphously perverse sex. So I think there's a possibility of some of this cordoning off, breaking down, and I look to films that bring us what I would like to call hardcore art.
Can I ask an even much more general question? Since it's clear that it's difficult to have a conversation about sexuality, we were told that we should treat this as if we were in our living room at dinner. I don't know what dinners on the Upper East Side are like, but it's a little hard to do that. But I'll pretend. Okay. That's a little. That I understand better. It's hard to talk about sexuality, obviously, without talking about questions about ideology, morality, tolerance, and so on. But I take it one of the perhaps hidden advantages of the word paraphilia is it bears on its face that it's a technical term which at least raises the question about whether there's a way of having a discourse about sexuality that's not entirely moral or ideological or political. Indeed, I mean, perversion is a technical term in the history of medicine. It has, when it's first used to describe sexuality, it has nothing to do with morality. Perversion is one kind of deviation of function. You can augment function, you can extinguish function, you can diminish function, or function can be deviated into an inappropriate object, and that's what perversions are. And the idea, every psychiatrist in the 19th century is very clear about this. Their moral problems, they're called perversity. Their psychosexual problems, they're called perversions. And the problem is to try to carve out a scientific discourse about sexuality. And it has a very precise historical moment. It arises in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. At almost the same time, the technical concepts of homosexuality, fetishism, sadism, and masochism are all invented as words, just like paraphilia. Homosexuality, first called contrary sexual feeling, about 1870. Fetishism with Benet in the 1880s. And sadism and masochism are invented as terms by Richard von Krafft-Ebing in Psychopathia Sexualis. And it's amazing. If you look at the first edition of that book, there's one masochist in the case histories, namely the characters in Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's novel, and two sadists. The Marquis de Sade, and now I always forget whether it's Blackbeard or Bluebeard, whichever is the worst of the pirates. And then by the 12th edition of that book, there are hundreds of sadists, hundreds of masochists, really, they're everywhere. And it's an interesting phenomena to try to figure out what's going on. Actually, very few people know that Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who was a very distinguished author, wrote to Richard von Krafft-Ebing and said, "Why did you name a disease after me? I'm just a writer." And Krafft-Ebing, who was extremely intelligent, wrote back to him and said, "You're so much more acute than most medical doctors that you've described accurately a syndrome which we, after you, have only come to recognize." And I want to raise the question of what it means to have a scientific theory of sexuality. What role does that? The moral discourse on sexuality, political discourse on sexuality, we have a long history of, but we have a relatively short history of scientific theories of sexuality. I'm not talking about the biology of reproduction, but I mean sexuality as say, a biological impulse expressed psychologically, in which the psychological aspect of it is the object of the scientific theory. And since we have such a short history of that, it always occurs to me as an important question to know what are the conditions under which and why do we need a scientific theory of sexuality? And I'm not talking about whether the psychoanalytic theory is true, or this theory true, or that theory is true, but what is added to the study of sexuality by having a scientific theory that's not captured by the moral and political discourse? Because the whole topic of trying to isolate paraphilias as a category in the way that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association does is clearly an attempt, whether it's a successful attempt or a failed attempt is less interesting to me at this moment, but it's an attempt to try to demarcate criteria by which one can discuss sexuality scientifically with the minimal amount of infiltration of moral and ideological discourse. So why do we need a scientific theory of sexuality? What does it do for us that we don't get if we just talk about sex in moral or political or religious terms?
Well, let me jump in with that. First of all, let me just offer a disclaimer. Although I'm on the DSM sexual disorders work group, whatever I say are strictly my own opinions and do not reflect at all any portion of the DSM or work group or whatever. I think at such point in the future as we formalize criteria and these will be forthcoming, but these are my own thoughts. Now, I think you raise a good question. What is the reason for this science? What more information could you hope to gain? Actually, in thinking about this, I there's a quote that I came across from Charles Darwin, which was written in 1862, who says, "We do not even in the least know the final cause of sexuality. The whole subject is written in darkness, hidden in darkness." That was in 1862. Now, if there's a book called Sexual Deviance, which is edited by Richard Laws and William O'Donoghue, which is now its second edition, which contains a lot of information about the various paraphilias. It's probably the most comprehensive of the books. Many people would disagree with the even basic title of deviance, but just one chapter in there discussing sexual sadism says, in 1986, these two authors, Bush and Kavanaugh, stated that most of the work in this area consisted of unfounded statements, unsupported by data, unevaluated case reports, lacking rigorous evaluation of other contributory factors, and scientific case reports of individuals or small groups. Regrettably, the same can be said today, over 20 years later. Now, you get to nomenclature such as polymorphous perverse sexuality. These are very broad terms, very difficult to operationalize, and I think that we're sort of in the discourse on sexuality kind of stuck, or have been stuck in concepts and language which is not led too much in the line of scientific discovery. I think that some of this sort of lack of scientific discovery, I would say, is because of the failure or abhorrence of society to really support any kind of research in this area. And sort of as a professional who's tried to get grants and various other things, there really is a dearth of support for studies on sexuality, studies on deviant sexuality, and so on. Now, I think that the whole question of why develop a science of sexuality is a reasonable one and a joinable one, so to speak. And I think that what are you going to do with this sort of science? I think that any number of things come to mind. I mean, society is investing a huge amount of money right now in terms of sexual crime, sexual criminals. And I think that it would be of benefit to be able to understand more what some of the etiology is, what the nature of these things are, how to treat, prevent, contain certain sexual criminal acts or criminality. And I think that there's a lot that could be really done, or really I think that a science of sexuality could be useful. I guess let me contain my questions there, stop my questions there, and I'll make that general proposition and kind of turn things over to others here.
Arnold, in your asking your question, you're implying that it is useless, and
well, useless may be a bit too strong, but it's a fascinating historical fact that sexuality becomes an object of scientific theory at a very particular moment, and I don't know of any attempt to conceptualize the notion of perversion, paraphilia, whatever you want to call it, which is thoroughly coherent. That is to say, indeed, I'd make even the stronger claim. I'm not sure that the division between the normal and the pathological in any of the psychological sciences, I'm not talking just about sexuality, but indeed in any of the human sciences more generally conceived is entirely coherent. Look, I'll give you a provocative example. Well, first there's some historical examples. Since homosexuality, sadism, masochism, and fetishism, the four great perversions, arise at, roughly speaking, the same time, although they have very different histories. Homosexuality gets more or less declassified, ego-dystonic and ego-syntonic homosexuality Anyway, it has a different history than some of the other categories. But take something like fetishism. Take just the definition of fetishism, which is usually defined as, and now we get into problems about how to have a psychological vocabulary. I noticed that even in the description, the very refined description of the panel on paraphilias, it starts in relationships where anxiety, I take to be a psychological term, is relatively absent, and where trust, empathy, and intimacy prevail. Well, I think trust, empathy, and intimacy are moral terms, not psychological terms. So we have a psychological term, anxiety, contrasted with three moral terms, trust, empathy, and intimacy. And then this gets repeated in the second part of the definition, where we have psychological terms, anxiety, intense ambivalence, etc., against tender, loving feelings, which I think is not actually a psychological concept. So the mixture of these concepts seems to me, in every attempt, either more explicitly or less explicitly, when you talk about the division between the normal and the pathological, to be something which is inevitable in the attempt to have these demarcations. So fetishism, here's the example. So take shoe fetishism. Sure.
I think your point is clear. You don't need to illustrate it with more issues, but you raised two questions. One, the strong insistence that there's no way to draw a clear limit between what is normal and what is pathological in all that area. I doubt whether anybody would be in disagreement with that. But then you also point out that this was scientificized at the same time in history at one point. And that is interesting. You are absolutely right. I would like to invite you to drop the other shoe. What do you think, why at that point all this were medicalized, put into boxes and made pathology?
Do you have a month? I don't actually think there's one reason. I actually think there's some reasons that are very complicated and perhaps not the appropriate topic here, internal reasons to the history of medicine. Can you have pathologies that don't have an organic basis? Can you have pathologies for which you cannot find any underlying, in the 19th century, lesions? Right? So you may find it absurd, but it's not absurd. It's well motivated by the constraints of science at the time that people do autopsies on individuals classified as homosexual to try to find, first they do autopsies on the genital regions, can find no malformations. So then they do what we do today. They look at the brain, right? Because they figure in the brain there's got to be something. And you can find a lot of things. So the most sophisticated, in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, we call it the New England Journal of Medicine, hardly a minor medical journal, up through the 1880s, you could actually find autopsy reports of masturbators in which, and I think nothing is made up, absolutely nothing is made up. Various, so there were views about where the sexual instinct was localized. It was adjacent to the optic nerve. That's why masturbators go blind. But we laugh with historical hindsight. I actually don't think it's so funny. I think it illustrates some of the constraints about internal to the history of medicine about where you have to look and what happens. A whole new kind of disorder emerges, so-called functional disorders. And functional disorders can be diagnosed without having to show that there's an underlying organic pathology. So hysteria becomes the great functional disorder initially, but perversions as well. And when you have these functional disorders, which are exactly that, deviations of function, with no necessary underlying organic pathology, although let's be fair, the neurologists who become psychiatrists in the 19th century say exactly what neurologists who are psychiatrists say today. The words are identical. They say, with future research and better techniques, we will be able to discover the underlying pathologies we can't yet see today. Right? They say that in the 19th century. They say it today, and there's a good reason for saying it. It's not mere ideology. It has to do with the way the whole science functions. But once you have these functional pathologies, which are diagnosed as deviations of function, the criteria of what's going to go into the normal and what's going to go into the pathological necessarily breaks down, because it presupposes that you can say what the appropriate function is. So what's the appropriate function of sexuality? Is the appropriate function of sexuality, well, I presume no one, at least here today, or no one's willing to admit that they think it's reproduction. I mean, that's fine, but as the only appropriate aim. So what's the appropriate aim of sexuality? Well, if you actually read all the definitions of paraphilia, it's hard to tell exactly what it's supposed to be. The ultimate goal of sexual satisfaction, is that what the aim is supposed to be? Well, then one's going to have trouble getting the right categories to align. The perverse things in one category, the so-called normal things in another category. And the fact is that although perhaps no one thinks, I don't think it's true that no one thinks, but most, certainly psychoanalysts don't think, and many psychiatrists don't think, there's a clear division, pathology here, normal here, but rather that all of these impulses are universal, and so you start saying things exactly like what are in the definition. Well, when there's a predominance of aggressive feelings, well, when the ultimate aim is not sexual satisfaction, but there's more anxiety or more repetition than you would normally find, and you start loosening the criteria for normal and pathological in such a way that you lose your grip on anything that's going to count as a reasonable criteria, I think. You just don't have it anymore.
Otto, could I interpose 1 second?
Sure.
Because I read Susan Winemaker's, I just actually read it last night, her memoir. And it's a laboratory of a scientific sexuality of a certain kind. I mean, your book is the most detailed. I mean, I haven't seen anything quite as detailed in actually the lexicon of articles and psychoanalytic texts I've read. And it's a study of a certain type. So, I was going to invite her to provide it, because in some sense it's the study of the pathology, the study of the case, the anomaly, is instructive in certain senses.
Would you say it's a pathology?
Well, I would say because I was a dominatrix. It's not. It was never. Everyone that comes has a certain, fantasy or perversion or something they want to explore. It's not my role, or was never my role, to say, well, where did that come from? Why are you this way? They never. They don't even want to discuss it. The point is, once you get into that room and into that space, it's about exploring that. It's not about judgment, it's about acceptance. And so the two of you there's a trust and an intimacy, because they're open, they're feeling accepted. And it's two people just trying to, instead of judge it or pathologize it, just to actually explore whatever that fantasy is and see. And then again, I suppose in this definition, it seems to say that sort of perversion is really when it becomes, whatever it is, becomes extremely repetitive and rigid and imbalanced. And so that becomes the only thing. So, but in the dungeon or in that space, it's really about exploring something and maybe just there's bringing my own my sense into it. It's two people tangoing, it's two people kind of relating to each other, so it's a dynamic, it's interactive, it's a theater, and it's just really, that's the starting point, is just an exploration to see, well, let's see where this goes. Let's see if this is, if we can probe it deeper, if we can find something, beyond just sexual, it's beyond sexual satisfaction, it's about sexual exploration, about just, seeing, how far something can go.
But it's not a space of the normal and the pathological.
No, absolutely not. I mean, that never enters the discussion. It's never, and even, me being in that moment with that person, with whatever their needs are, it's Yeah, it's a space of, it's about openness, really. It's about just sort of exploring it and seeing, yes, I mean, there's no judgment there. It's just about working with what is in a kind of dynamic, real way with a sense of sort of, yeah.
You had a fantastic amount of implements and all kinds of, I mean, I was familiar with some of this, but I mean, the way you described some of it, beyond, some of the ones I'd known, but some of them I didn't, but it was like an orchestra. I mean, you call it concertina.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing, before when I first started domination or being a dominatrix, I read as many books as I could, trying to kind of arm myself in that way to really understand what am I walking into. And then the minute I'm in that situation, it's not about thinking, it's not about analyzing as it's happening, because that's then going to sort of limit the kind of spontaneity of it, or the sort of the dialogue between it. So it's not a play. It's sort of something before analysis or beyond or aside from. It's really.
Do the people who are there, who are your clients, do they worry about whether they're normal or not?
Yeah, I suppose they do. But however, in this space, in that safe space, they don't. It's not really a question of normal and not normal. It's a question of exploration, curiosity to see what happens there. Two people trying to together kind of, play and see where that goes, or see what comes with it. See what comes of it.
It's interesting that you say spontaneity, because the language that we've been hearing is, on the one hand, there's loving and all of those good moral terms, and on the other hand, there's rigid, fixed.
Right.
And that seems to be the opposition that seems to operate between some kind of normal sex and some kind of perverse sex. And yet you're saying that within this situation it is possible for there to be spontaneous,
absolutely
imaginative play.
Yeah. So the idea of repetition, I have the problem with it, because repetition can lead to sort of rigidity, and then it's repeating the same thing over. But repetition also, so a client comes and they have a certain scenario they want to play out, and every time they come they want to play out the same scenario. So there's repetition, or they want simply just to be, beaten or spanked or whatever. So it's okay, I'll spank them this time, and next time spank them again, it's the same. But there's variation within repetition. So, so it's, and repetition almost allows for you to kind of go deeper into that sort of variation. So, okay, this time I'm going to spank them a little bit harder, or this time I'm going to, it just sort of, it's just, there is variation within repetition. And when that stops, when it's no longer an exploration within that, then I think it becomes rigid, compulsory, repetitive,
which, of course, normal
imbalanced.
sex can be, too.
Exactly.
Rigid, repetitive.
Absolutely.
But that's the point.
Absolutely.
Rigid is not a very good criteria, because the heterosexual couple who, have sexual relations in their own bedroom at a certain time in the week, doing the same thing, that's about as rigid as you can get.
Exactly.
And no one thinks they're suffering from a paraphilia.
Exactly.
Right. And the other binary that has been upset, I think, in our current way of in the way things are happening with us in our sexual cultures, is that we like to think there's private, and that's all in behind the locked door, and then we like to think that there's public. But in fact, with mediation, with media, with the prevalence of media, that which is public has increasingly also been private, and that which is private has become public. And so I cannot have sex without all of the media examples of sex that I have ever seen in some way informing them. Right now, with all of the ways in which I call them small screens, but televisions and interactive videos, which are forms of pornography, which have invaded, as we say, invaded the privacy of the home. And since 1972, the fact that we have been watching sex in public kinds of places. So we can't really have this inviolate public-private either, just as we can't have the rigid and as some kind of bad
Doesn't
thing.
everybody really think, no matter whether they think there are paraphilias or aren't, or where the criterion is, or how to draw the boundary, almost everybody, whatever their difference is, thinks that sexuality in terms of fantasies, and especially in terms of psychological exploration, reveals something profoundly deep about the individual, right? That, you know,
The core.
tell me what your really hidden fantasies are, and I'll tell you something about yourself, about who you really are. And it goes back to the 19th century, that the Krafft-Ebing's remark is that upon the sexual sensibility, the mental individuality of the person largely depends. Now, and I think that people have very different views about the moral appropriateness or inappropriateness of various kinds of sexual activity, share the view that there's something about sexuality which is especially revelatory about the deep hidden truth of the individual, which can only come out under certain conditions. That's why it comes out in fantasy more than, or at least as much as it does in activity. And so I wonder what...
Converse true also. You tell me something deep about personality, it's revelatory possibly about the sexuality.
Yes, that is both the sexuality reveals something about other aspects of your personality, and other aspects of your personality reveal something about your sexuality. Just think of the way you can draw a nice causal chain between almost everything and sexuality. Not everything, but almost everything.
I don't agree. I mean,
Okay.
I think that you can certainly, through psychoanalytic interpretation, impose degrees of understanding, layers of understanding, and whatever on any particular act. I can recall a Godard movie where he said you can explain everything in the world with communism or Marxism or with psychoanalysis. You can just sort of look at it and whatever it is, you can explain it.
French Revolution explains everything.
You've got everything. But I think that by and large, people elect certain sexual preferences, and they involve themselves with men, women, whatever their choice is, in a certain set of acts, and that's it. And you can impose a little or a lot of depth or understanding or meaning, but pretty much what you see is what you have. And I think that, for instance, in our practice, we get a lot of people who have been in psychoanalysis for years and years and years and years and years, and they have understandings which are deep and ongoing and so on, but there's still issues with them controlling their behavior, and they really haven't changed their particular interest, selection, and so on. So I don't, you can certainly impose a lot of understanding on any particular thing, but or sexual behavior, but I don't think that, I don't know how helpful that is, so to speak.
It seems to me that there's a dialectic going on here regarding whether we are justified in classifying scientifically sexuality, defining pathology of sexuality, or to what extent in doing this we are trying to apply scientific principles to areas of cultural, social, ethical realm that really are beyond the scientific area. I think that that's what you are saying, and that at one point in history, science took over, pathologized important aspects of sexuality, and we are now suffering the consequences. I was interested in whether you were going to say something why that particular historical element, but you told us that you would need a month for that, so we'll leave it at that.
I also think it's a form of control of the individual. There are political reasons.
Yeah.
That is, the control of sexuality opens up a huge space of the disciplining of individuals that wasn't present before.
I suspected that there was a Foucaultian position behind what you were saying.
I think that's one aspect of it, yeah.
In other words, that at that point, shall we say it very simply, capitalist society took over the control of individuals by means of the scientific control, so to speak, of sexuality, and we are still suffering the consequences. I would guess that you, Richard, disagree with that and would think that there are good, solid reasons for which certain behaviors should be called pathological, and we're referring particularly of those aspects of sexuality that are controlled by aggressive behavior and mean attack by individuals on others or on society that requires social action. And the question is, should this social action be in terms of punishment for inappropriate behavior or treatment of pathology? I'm talking about those aspects of what we call perversions that imply such invasion of privacy, voyeurism, exhibitionism, sexual assaults, and aggression in sexual behavior that is dangerous to health and survival.
Well, I mean,
am I speaking for your position?
Somewhat. I think that, as I would see it, some of the issue is that people are concerned about the science of sexuality being some kind of sort of hidden way or overt way for society and the majority to control the minority or to control various aspects of unconventional sexual behavior or what's perceived as deviant sexual behavior. So I think there's a concern on that level, and I also think that there perhaps is more kind of an embarrassment or an aversion on society's part to studying sexuality, I think that it's clear to me that there are people who get into trouble because of their sexual behavior, and I think that this could be understood I mean, these are illegal behaviors. For instance, we take the notion of pedophilia or the diagnosis of pedophilia. These are individuals who abuse children. This is illegal. Some would say immoral. There are people that repeatedly are unable to control themselves from abusing children. And I think that it would make sense from society's point of view to view this more as a medical disorder or as a psychological disorder than to criminalize it all the time. Because I would draw the analogy between, let's say, substance use and abuse and some of the paraphilias. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, say earlier, let's say heroin addiction, alcoholism, and so on were criminalized. And what happened is you got thrown into jail instead of being referred to appropriate treatment facilities. And the sort of adoption of these behaviors, the whole construct of alcoholism or substance abuse as a disease, I think has resulted in society viewing this differently and being more successful at helping individuals control themselves. So you've had the whole evolution of a scientific literature involving substance use, abuse, and so on. I would say by analogy that some of these sexual behaviors are quite similar, such as pedophilia. I mean, pedophiles are scorned, institutionalized. Everybody wants to throw away the key, but from a point of view, for instance, of cost, becomes very expensive for society to do that. And I think that there are alternative ways of dealing with individuals who are pedophiles. I think that there's not been a lot of investigation in terms of treatments that might be available, but I think that it's a reasonable thing to consider pedophilia a disease and to try and develop rational treatments and to study this in a reasonable, in a scientific way. That would be one instance of where I believe that there is a syndrome, a medical syndrome, which can be identified and which can be the focus of scientific investigation and development of treatments. How much you could extend this across the spectrum into other paraphilias, I don't know, but this would be one example of my position.
But let me raise a question to the panel. If we assume that there are certain manifestations of sexuality, I mean, pedophilia clearly is, that can be used as a standard case. Certain manifestations of sexuality in which other human beings are attacked, at risk, damaged, and society intervenes to protect its members by criminalizing certain behaviors and at the same time acknowledging that certain behaviors that legally are criminal may at the same time reflect psychological illness that needs to be studied. I'm following your thought in this regard. And there would be a classification of the behaviors that are demean an attack on other people, not sexual pathology. The sexual ways of attacking would be just one way. Another one is to set fires, to rob, to steal, to break in. In other words, an abandonment of the effort to classify pathology in terms of a general classification of all sexual behaviors. That would still leave the room for classifying certain sexual inhibitions that have either a medical or, let's say, an organic or a psychological cause, and that require treatment. Take impotence, that has sometimes biological causes and most of the time psychological ones that can be treated psychologically. And the classification as an illness would not imply a total control of sexuality. We would abandon the whole concept of paraphilias in that regard. Is that something with which everybody would feel comfortable?
I think the advantage of what you're suggesting would be that we would no longer be talking about fetishism and pedophilia in the same breath, which I think is a very unfortunate practice.
And the fetishism was about having little 6-year-olds wear particular shoes for the persons. But I think that I'd like not so much to focus on the issue of disease or pathology or legal matters. The question is, there are differences. There are differences in sexuality on a spectrum. But there is a point at the spectrum where things are different and things are repetitive. So, and I think Susan's book is really, as Francis says, a place when you can learn tremendous amount, which you cannot necessarily learn one cannot necessarily learn in one's practice, because she not only reveals what's going on with the client, but she also reveals a lot of the thoughts that go through her mind. One client comes time after time after time for Susan to sit on his face until he cannot breathe, and then get off, and then sit again, and then get off. Now, doesn't matter whether it is pathological or not, it's completely irrelevant. What's interesting is what causes this. Since not everybody has this, what makes for this to happen? And this is just one example. There are many other examples. I think when you gave the example of the couple who do this thing rigidly, well, that's on that spectrum. In other words, the more there is anxiety or whatever else, and there's certainly too many questions for any one of us to have the answers to, something causes this kind of repetitive, to some degree rigid. It's true that within the rigidity you have flexibility, but the one who wants you to sit on his face doesn't come to you and say, I don't want you to sit on my face, I want us today to do a tango.
No, they don't say it, but they mean that. They do mean that.
Well, but they mean tango in a different way. In other words, in order for you to get paid for what you do with this particular individual, you have to sit on his face.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So there is a rigidity, there is a repetitiveness, despite the little variation within it. Why does this happen?
Well, why do you have to ask that question?
Right.
Because I want to know.
Exactly.
If a guy likes well, who cares?
Exactly.
If a guy likes somebody to sit on his face and he doesn't smother, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it.
You can spend 5 years trying to
There's
figure
nothing
out.
wrong with that. You're looking at it the wrong way. And I think it comes back to what you said about medical and scientific. The scientific endeavor is to understand, and to understand as much as possible. The scientific attitude towards the fellow who comes and does that is to understand what it is about, not to change it, but because it is it's a well of information. It's something you can use that will broaden your understanding of a number of other things, like many of the discoveries in science have done. You understand one thing, and from that you understand a lot of other things.
About a particular individual, but to what?
Well, I'm not so sure that's the particular
Well,
individual.
no, wait. I mean, to what effect is this understanding of why this person likes his face sat around? I mean, it could be his mother did it repeatedly.
I have no idea. It doesn't matter.
But you could expend forever trying to understand it.
I think you are
It is
wrong.
a futile.
No, you're
practice.
looking at it as your criticism of psychoanalysis, which you made earlier. I'm not talking psychoanalytic.
Okay.
If a person comes to you and he's coughing, and you take his temperature and he has fever, you don't say, what does it matter? This guy has fever and he's coughing. So what? You try to understand what that is about. I assume.
No,
Yes,
this is not a fever. This is not a cough. This is a sexual preference, which is nothing wrong with it.
It's not. That's not the attitude. It's not the
But you
condition.
assume this man is suffering, the way the man
I'm
with the
not
cough
saying
is
he's
suffering.
But surely
You are
there's some things which have a causal explanation that you're not interested in. For example, you want rigid, repetitive behavior? Half the people in the world go and eat ice cream once a week and they only get the same flavor. They only get chocolate, they never eat vanilla. Do you think we need a causal explanation of that?
Fortunately today, science tries to understand those things because they are giving us a wealth of information about a broad array of things. That's what a lot of the neuroscientific studies are about.
Right, but how you demarcate the objects that stand in need of causal explanation, if you don't demarcate them, then anything, literally anything.
You just said one demarcation is
Okay.
the fact that it is a certain individual or a group of individuals who go always to the same ice cream place and have the same flavor every time.
And you think we need a causal explanation of that?
Often there are causal explanations.
Well,
We had a round table here. Where the fellow brought a little test tube with a certain odor in it, a certain chemical substance that had an odor in it. And when he sent that around, some people could smell that, and some people could not smell that. There is evidence that the people who smell that have a different chemical structure and chemical reactions than others, and that can have consequences. That's the level I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the level you were referring to. That these things, if understood, give us more information about what we are about in this world.
But
I would agree with that broad description. I mean, I think you need a nomenclature which will allow you to extend your data collection beyond a particular individual into a broad population, so to speak.
And I think that implied in your question is the idea that it is not a problem if you have a heterosexual couple assuming the missionary position
No, not at all.
every time?
That's being studied too.
That's being, okay, so, all right.
We had people here
But one is being pathologized.
No, no,
I mean, there's a kind of tradition of pathologizing that runs behind the study of the person who sits on the, whose face is sat upon.
I am aware that there is that tendency, but I don't think that's what we have in mind. When we had the biology of sexuality as a roundtable, when we had the chemistry of sexuality as a roundtable, the researchers that are working on those are revealing things about the way the brain, the body work that without those explorations you wouldn't know. The role of oxytocin, for example, in it causing attachment between the newborn and the mother. That's a very important discovery. So I think these variations, or whatever you want to call them, in a way are a very rich laboratory.
So do you think DSM-5 should, when pedophilia...
I have no interest in DSM-5. I never looked at DSM-4. I've stopped with DSM-1 or 2 or whatever. It's not in my interest.
Look, we showed a film here called Writer of O. It was about the woman who wrote the story of O. And the crux of the film, it really pointed to the religious convictions, in a certain sense, of the author of the book. That there was it's interesting. It was just one of the many. It was multi-determined. There was multifaceted kind of exploration into what is called sadomasochism. It's not to say that there is an ideology that's produced, but that there are many different kinds with the kind of causality that it's talking. What goes behind this? What are the drives? What is the loss of selfhood? What are the impulses that surround merely the existential phenomena? And that's it. And I think you get that in your book.
But not through going cause to effect, but kind of going from what it is and then going forward with it and exploring it in all those and in that way understanding through action and through interaction, through playing it out, this fantasy or whatever, and not through what's causing this, but more through observation, and through interaction to people. And so who's learning? We're both learning. I don't know if it's applicable to anyone else actually, but it's the individual, especially them, who don't understand necessarily why they are the way they are, but they're not even questioning it. The point is they feel the way they do, and now they're in a safe environment where they want to explore it and see what it does and where it goes.
And
so for them, they're really learning about themselves, and they're learning, it's an exploration for them.
And then there's the character of Adam, that becomes even more interesting than I thought, because there you start to introduce really the kind of question of sentimentality into the whole.
Yeah, well, the question of love too, a relationship.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, I mean, in the book, yeah.
I think that there is disagreement regarding whether we should study the causes of psychological functioning or not. That seems to be a kind of, to me, a narrow viewpoint. I think it's of interest to study psychological function like everything else. It gets confused to some extent with pathologizing behavior. And when it comes to sexuality, there is undoubtedly, I think, a social tendency to pathologize behavior and to extend pseudo-scientific classifications to what may be part of a broad spectrum of human potential in the sexual area. I guess that we all agree on that. So it raises the question, first of all, whether we should talk about pathology only when an individual suffers significantly so that he looks for help with something, and something is wrong, and he looks for help, and we should try to help, or when behavior of the individual creates disturbances in the social area that affect well-being or life of others, and then there's something wrong and we should look into it, even if the individual couldn't care less if he can get away with it. I think these are natural boundaries in which the search for knowledge and scientific search for knowledge seems justified. The problem is, as you have pointed out, that under the effect of social and political pressures, the control of sexuality has been extended way beyond that to an extent of artificial, pseudoscientific approach to that field and restriction of individual freedom to engage in whatever kind of sexuality they want to. Is that a general agreement on that point?
No, I mean, the U.S. I mean, you have privacy and you have privacy rights and so on. I mean, there may be a variety of opinion, but this is not Iran, or this is not. I mean, I guess within states, certain states, obviously, I mean, it's a whole horrendous history of laws which have intruded. But I think basically people are allowed to practice what they want in privacy. I actually just been rereading this. It says when such, sort of in the broad formation of things, when such play, relationships were, when such play, sexual gameplay, I guess, becomes rigid, repetitive, ritualistic, and compulsory. I mean, those would describe sort of sexual practices which evolve, which are normative, people like. I mean, so that's not pathological. And when the game becomes the goal, well, I mean, that's a lot of sexuality. I mean, often accompanied by anxiety, intense ambivalence, and a strong predominance of aggressive feelings over tender, loving feelings. Again, somebody would want, I mean, this could be the goal of certain things. I mean, you don't have to be tender and loving with a lot of your sex play. Psychoanalysts talk about paraphilia, or perversion. So I'm just sort of struck that this is not, for instance, what the DSM might refer to as paraphilia. And this just, I don't really agree with that whole statement, the whole premise at all.
I'm
sorry, I figured you did. I'm sorry.
No, but I will answer you, because what you did there, you read different parts of the sentences and you said, I don't agree with it, or that everybody does that. That is not my experience, and I don't think that would be the experience of any clinician working with people in the intensive way that the psychoanalyst does.
So you say, for example,
let's just wait. You say, for example, there it says about aggression is more prominent than loving feelings. Then you say, well, everybody does that. That's not true. If in sexuality the primary emotion is aggression, there is a problem.
I don't
and
agree.
Not necessarily.
If the problem is, I think there is a...
Who's the problem? Who is it a problem for?
It doesn't matter. It's a question of trying to understand if there is more aggression if in a sexual situation the prominent impulse is aggressive. Why is that the case?
Well, suppose someone's just tender and loving all the time and they can never feel real passion.
No,
is that a problem?
No, but what you are doing...
Seriously, is that a problem too?
No, what you are doing is you are using that kind of argument, which is you go to the opposite extreme and you say, is that a problem too? No, it could be a problem also, yes.
No, we have
That's the answer.
Let me go into some clinical matter. Let's say you have a couple, he enjoys to biting her buttocks and she loves that he does that, and they both enjoy that. That can be classified as aggressive behavior or sadomasochistic, but it is. I would consider that perfectly normal.
I don't.
Let me.
No, but let me correct it before you go further, because what you are assuming is that biting is connected to aggression, and what I am saying is that biting may not be connected to the aggression.
Okay. What does that mean?
But it might be ritualized.
Okay.
It may be ritualized.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Okay, let me change.
Look, I'm not against this stuff.
Well, but again, it seems to me that we are implicitly agreeing that as long as there's mutual consent, couple can do whatever they want to. And if he wants her to sit on him and to shit on his face, and both are happy with that, that's fine. But if one of the two, I'm talking about an actual patient of a past project, but if one of them feels that that's intolerable, that's aggressive, and in the ensuing dialogue things break up, clearly a couple breaks up, and if it happens to that individual who cannot have ever any sex, if he doesn't have a chance to sit on a specially constructed toilet on top of the face of somebody else and shit on that person has a problem. I think clearly there's some kind of pathology. The issue of quantity becoming transformed in quality seems to me by most criteria acceptable. So we can't relativize things extremely, but on the other hand, insist in separating out extreme cases in which there's really a disturbance already in the immediate social realm. I would raise the question whether, Susan, I have not read your book, but if you describe what happens in a general SM parlor, I would not consider that as that doesn't fit into my definition of perversion as pathology. It may be something that fits together with many activities and interaction of everybody there with the others there and many other people outside that give a freedom, flexibility, multiplicity of sexual behavior that's by mutual consent, doesn't affect anybody, and I wouldn't consider that as pathology.
What about mutilation, though? What about you take Oshimas in the realm of the senses, where the penis is cut off or something like that? If it's mutually consensual.
Mutual consensus.
Like Oshima's movie in the realm of the senses, the penis of the character is cut off. Let's say there was a mutual...
He's actually already dead when that happens.
But I'm just saying, let's say we have a...
If there is a mutual agreement...
If there's a mutual agreement...
Excuse me.
There was a mutual agreement.
Excuse me, you have interrupted me before I spoke. Thank you. If there is a mutual agreement in behavior that is damaging to health or life, that's pathology. If it's agreed by both of them. I did not imply that at all. Let me remind you that I talked about limit of any kind of human activities that creates damage to self or others or death, and I think that is pathology. There I would say the medical standpoint is warranted.
Yeah.
And in my practice, I see patients who might fit into paraphilia in the definition of DSM-4. They feel perfectly fine. They make all the arrangements, and they have an equilibrium with which they are satisfied. I would say, so why do you come for treatment? And they think I'm the best psychiatrist of the world. But if this is part of a constellation in which there is a general unhappiness with himself or herself, and sex or problems in sex affect problems in love at the same time, because sex and love are intimately connected, and we haven't talked about this so far much. And the total love life is affected by sex and vice versa, then we have a problem that requires evaluation and treatment. Now, I agree that much of this defies the kind of rigid medical classification, and from that viewpoint, I repudiate the DSM system or the ICD system, as well as most other people in this panel. But originally, to justify DSM. Originally, it was considered as diagnostic criteria for research purposes, to operationalize issues that required research, so people knew they were doing research on the same way. The fact that it has become a reader's digest of treatment in psychiatry, and that nowadays psychiatrists, the only thing they know is this little booklet to make diagnosis, with the deterioration of the entire science, that is a social problem. And that brings us back to misuse of psychiatry. Of course, now mostly for financial reasons.
But again, your example, the films, in the realm of the senses, and especially Pasolini's Salo, are not supposed to be films about perversion or pathology. They're political films. And we inevitably reinterpret them with in the broadest sense, these categories of psychological functioning and pathology. If you read what Pasolini says about Salo, he doesn't think it's a representation of anything that's even in the realm of the pathological or the normal.
But who cares what he says? I'm free to look into. I'm free
that's
to
right.
right now,
That's right.
right
But
away.
that's my point. What we do is we reinterpret these things with those categories, whether we interpret them as normal or pathological. We interpret them with those categories. And I think the problem is that we don't have a very
rich system of categorization.
We don't have a rich system of categorization for talking about sexuality that doesn't implicitly use those categories. But I think that's the problem. Part of, right until the end of your description, it sounded like you were describing a problem that we could easily conceptualize in ethical terms. There's someone who won't agree to something, or someone who wants to do something, questions about consent. Those don't require psychological categories. They require ethical categories.
Yeah, but isn't there a development? No questions until we...
And the question is, why are we worried? What are we afraid of if we talk about sexuality in just ethical and political terms?
Or aesthetic terms. Because frankly,
Fine.
In the realm of the senses is an absolutely beautiful film about two people who decide to go absolutely to the end, and they find that that end is the death of one of them. But it is not, I think you're right, it doesn't enhance our understanding of the film to apply the term masochism or sadism to it. In fact, it detracts. And then it just becomes a kind of clinical example instead of this exploration of this possibility of going that far.
Well, you see, the emotions that are generated with an aesthetic experience are the same subject of study in terms of a better understanding how things work, as are the sexual stuff. There is no distinction. I think all this talk about pathology, yes, obviously, the moment you have psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, doctors, they have to talk about pathology. But pathology, aside from treating people and making them better, can also be useful because it's a laboratory of understanding the normality better. Much of what is known in medicine about normal things comes from studying conditions that are less normal. But I'm not
But
saying
literature is a
morality
perfect
and
way
politics.
to understand
That's
those
another
things.
way.
Okay, but we
have a
don't ask
problem
for the
with that.
causal explanations of the literature. We think we get understanding of it by reading the literary text.
Yes.
By participating.
Okay, well,
But we have to go to the...
Thank you for reminding me that it's 4:07.
Daphne, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
You had your hand up?
No, I just wanted to say,
Come to the microphone for a second.
I just wanted to bring up two things I was struck by. My name is Daphne Merck, and I've actually, unlike many of you, written about my sexual life in the New Yorker. One is only to try and write about one's sexual life to see how well outside the confines of theory people remain shockable. I mean, we all live... one thing I found odd about this discussion is it either got very specific or very concrete. Like, if you shit on someone's face, is that a paraphilia? The truth of the matter is this is all internalized. We live with the burden of the normative. We're all brought up. We're all socialized. We're all taught, I'm sure there are exceptions, we're all taught very young to have feelings about nudity, forget having feelings about sleeping with someone of the same sex, or shitting on someone's head. We're taught very basic constrictions. And somehow, to me, this all got kind of it's not only about a Foucaultian interpretation of an imposition of social order. We all live within families. that have their own social order. So I somehow felt the normative aspect that rests behind a vocabulary, a lexicon of perversions and the non-perverse got completely lost. The other thing I guess I had mixed feelings about was using I'm very curious to read your book, but I kept thinking about the dominatrix's dungeon, a little like the psychoanalyst's office. You're paying. No, I want to make this more strongly. You're paying for you're paying for whatever experience you have. Mm-hmm. And somehow you made it sound like it was this extraordinarily wonderful, playful people, discovering themselves. Ideally, of course, you could say here there is no ideal. We could leave out all value judgments, but I'm happy to have some. Ideally, people, there's something to be said about the completely capitalist enterprise of a dominatrix. I mean, you're charging. You're comfortable with charging.
They're comfortable with that.
Yeah, but I'm saying I agree. I'm imposing a certain amount of value judgment. I'm just saying it's obviously a place that people go to because they carry within themselves the burden of the normative.
Right.
If they felt it was okay.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So all I want to say is somehow the internal structures seem to have gotten lost in what is supposed to be a psychoanalytic conversation. And they're in that aspect.
I don't think they were lost. There's a question of what are the normative structures and where do they come from? They come from a lot of different places, not just from society with a capital S. Of course they come from family dynamics. Of course they come from the fact that people use those very categories to interpret their own behavior. That is, those categories are naturally applied by them to how they think of themselves, and that's part of the problem.
There's a difference between theory and living in society. I would argue that living in society, as opposed to theory, is a much more sexually restricting experience than theory would allow for. You can argue, how did this arise? How did that arise? But in the end, if you look around you, and I will go by response to a piece I wrote in the New Yorker that was about what I would consider to be a playful paraphilia. However, since I have Ed's interest in the wherefore and whyfores, I do think there's something to be gained by looking into even the most playful of paraphilias. That simply to sort of let the question go at normal, abnormal, the invention of categorization seems to me not to take it far enough.
Are we letting it go?
Yeah. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, does the panel want us to respond to that first, or is it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just want to me it seems that we needn't let that go. I think that that it is important to get into the particulars and the dynamic and the interest of all sorts of deviant, abnormal, perverse sexualities. And actually, the films that I talk about often do. And I think that they are, without having to talk about personal experience, without having to analyze anyone, these films are actually a wonderful way to that examination.
Michael Sachs. It seems to me that something very important was missing throughout the entire discussion. After all, we're talking about sex. So where does desire, pleasure, satisfaction, and feeling work into it? And I think it was Arnold who, early in the discussion, talked about once you get beyond reproduction, what is the goal of sexuality? Similarly, when Susan was talking about her clients and talking about how it was an exploration, but an exploration to what end? Was it looking to reach a peak of excitement and intensity, a special orgasm? But where does that enter into this discussion of sexuality? And even I think when Ed was talking about looking at some of it more in an individual way, about talking about what might lead somebody to behave that way, isn't it true that you can find something about what might lead a person to behave that way by understanding the emotions that they're both feeling while they're in the course of doing whatever they're doing and the desires that lead them in that direction?
I think one of the very nice things, as I said, about the book is that you do get the sense of some of the emotions, and interestingly enough, not infrequently, there's quite a bit of anger going on in those rooms, in that room. But I think emotions are primary. The rest is built over the emotions.
Right, but just in looking at it, and looking at an individual, do we want to get our hands around the kinds of feelings that they have that's driving?
Totally.
My name is Larry Cutler. Isn't there a development of psychology going on? Development, for example, you mentioned perversion first, and now it's paraphilia. That's a new word, and sometimes when there's a new word, it means there's new understanding. I mean, and you mentioned something about, there's organic development, and there's organic causes of things, but I didn't hear you say, is there an inorganic structure? What is a structure that is not organic? Because there are structures, just like there's structures in a novel, there's structures in everything, but you can't see them. So I'm wondering if you mean that, because also this question of cause. I mean, sometimes you just want to, I want to understand, but there are some things that are even more important than one person understanding. You're talking about criminal behavior. Well, what are you going to do about it? You have to understand it, maybe, before you can really remove some of it, or maybe remove more and more of it. I mean, you shake your head, maybe not, and maybe it is the system that causes a lot of this, as you might think, and I think also. But there are many things about psychology. There are many things, and so there is a development. I mean, Freud comes up with this word. It's not a word, libido. Well, that was more than just a word. I mean, it wasn't just sex. Wasn't it more than sex? So in other words, it's a science. And a science means when there's more understanding, there's new words, there's all kinds of new things that develop out of it, isn't there?
I would like to comment briefly on one thing that you said about structures that are not organic structures. I think that's a very important concept. Science, when it deals with functional issues, it's just not dealing in the air with ideas, feelings, and cultural norms, but with psychological structures. And one thing that we've learned that there exist psychological structures, and psychoanalysis has contributed to knowing about these deep structures. In other words, about certain typical ways in which we experience reality, processes, and react. And these structures permit adaptation normally. Well-being, adaptation to our needs, expression of our desire, adaptation to the surrounding world, and they may become distorted and pathological without anything being wrong and without having to fiddle with the chemicals. And that, I think, shouldn't be forgotten.
It has to be known more of.
Hi, I'm Susan Wright, and I'm the spokesperson for the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, which is the advocacy organization, hello, by the way, advocacy organization for the sadomasochistic community, as well as the polyamory community, which is non-monogamy. And I think that we're seeing more from the real world perspective. Go back to just the DSM. I think what happens is we're pathologizing behavior, when perhaps we need to rethink it and pathologize the control of the behavior in terms of, I mean, I know that Dr. Krueger doesn't particularly agree with this, but the idea of impulse control, compulsion, sexual addiction, whether you're addicted to these behaviors or whether you're just playing out these behaviors in your ordinary sex life. The problem that we're finding in our community is that, for example, I just completed a recent survey of over 3,000 sadomasochists, and we found 26% had suffered some form of discrimination or violence because of their BDSM desires and behaviors. This is happening, playing out in the courts, and they're using the DSM. They're using the idea that just the behavior itself is pathological to punish people, to take away child custody, take away security clearances. So because it blends the healthy sexuality with the quote-unquote, deviant sexuality, the unhealthy sexuality. That's a problem. I think that's the biggest reason that I see that we need to get back to a scientific basis if we're going to talk about sexuality. And I think we need to get away from just the behaviors. It's like, OCD, if you have a hand-washing problem, it's not the hand-washing that's a problem. It's not the locking the doors. It's the behaviors that lead up to it. And I am particularly interested in what you're thinking about that in terms of, is it the behavior itself, or is there a way in which people are reacting to this behavior and using these behaviors? That's more the psychological motivation behind the pathology.
I'm not sure what you mean by pathologizing. You mean sort of objecting to society's response to these behaviors?
No, I mean, society responds to these behaviors in part because it's codified in our society that anything that's outside of the norm of sexuality is considered deviant. But the problem is that, like in the DSM right now, it says if you experience distress in your life, that's criteria B. Well, a lot of distress that happens in sadomasochist life is because of society, because the societal norms, maybe your partner doesn't agree with it, maybe they find out at your job and you get fired. You have significant distress in your life because of the BDSM. So under the current criteria, they would be considered mentally ill when they're really not.
Well, I mean, I think that there certainly has been in prior DSMs, and I'm sure will be in this, a lot of concern about the sort of use of the DSM to sort of pathologize behavior which is not typical or unusual. I mean, I think that people are concerned about the misuse of the DSM, and I think that this will be a central concern as far as I'm concerned. I think that the issue is trying to sort of develop boundaries and to sort of try and make some use of these categorizations and of the DSM. I agree that in the forensic area in particular, it's being used in the legal area, used in a way which people didn't originally contemplate, and I think that there will be a lot of concern about this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just say one thing in response also to a previous question? It's extraordinary. You can have a 2-hour discussion about sexuality. Now, I'm all for understanding, but which objects one chooses to give priority to seems to me always interesting. But we had virtually an hour-and-a-half discussion of sexuality, and except for one question, no one ever mentioned the word pleasure.
I did.
Well, you weren't. Well, okay. And
You said, what's the purpose of sex? I said pleasure.
the concept of pleasure, part of the problem of the concept of pleasure is there aren't normal and pathological pleasures. There are pleasures that you can act out in ways which are immoral. They might be related to structures of desire which get classified as pathological. What pleasure itself is a concept impervious almost to classifications of normal and pathological. Pleasure has to do with a kind of intensity and durability of a certain kind of feeling, and trying to talk about pleasures in terms of the categories of normal and pathological really becomes very difficult very, very quickly. And insofar as occasionally sex has something to do with pleasure, and pleasure, I think it's remarkable that Freud insists again and again that pleasure is the thing about which we know the least. Not desire, but pleasure. And that seems to me something worth thinking about in thinking about the way we conceptualize sexuality without talking about pleasure.
My question is actually a follow-up to the last one. Isn't trying to understand people and to prefer sexual behavior who go to see therapists or even go to see a dominatrix similar to studying homosexuality by observing people in jail, or men who go to see prostitutes? me.
That was sorry. Do not cough with the microphone on, it turns out.
On occasion, I go to the Eulenspiegel Society here in New York, which is sort of a self-help group for people into perverse behavior. And those people, for the most part, would never go to a dominatrix. In fact, when they talk, they say, if I can't meet someone, a partner, as a last resort, I'll go to a dominatrix. The normal person, the people who live this lifestyle 24/7, they're living normal, happy lives. They don't have any need for therapy. They don't have any need to see a dominatrix. And I'm just afraid that people who try to understand these people, from that subset of people, they're really not getting a true picture of what that lifestyle or that person is like.
Any comment about this, members of the panel?
You have to come to the microphone. It's being broadcast.
All right.
You can't just say that. You have to come to the microphone.
Yeah. And if we are going to stop at 4:30, we'll have to.
We have one more question.
It's quick anyway. I was a bit struck by the point that, this discussion about pathologizing behavior or not. And I think something that we see in DSM-4 and in medicine or behavior in general is that nothing is really a problem until it interferes or impacts on the degree to which we can function in different realms in our lives. And I think, going to a dominatrix is one thing. If I showed up at your door every morning and was raking up debt and wasn't spending time with my kids or whatever, then it becomes a problem that needs to be addressed. I think on a much lower level in a clinical setting, what I've seen in the past couple of years is internet addiction that has gone ballistic, and people that are losing sleep, having difficult relationships. And I think this is something that should be not pathologized, but definitely seen as a dysfunction in behavior that can be worked on.
I think that Dr. Kupfer of the DSM was quoted in the New York Times a few weeks ago saying that they're going to invest. There's an active interest in these sort of behavioral addictions. Internet addiction, sex, gambling, other things like that.
Well, it seems to me that
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philippides events is available at philippides.org.